Okay, and last but not least, we have quiz 10, and that was due last week and covered that grief response that children may have. The class did very well on this quiz. We had a class average of an 8.2, and that we had 3 people get a 10 out of 10, 2 with a 9, and then another 1, 2, 3, 3 with an 8 out of 10, and the lowest grade was a 60. So overall, very good job on this quiz. I had the wrong answer selected for one of the questions at first, so if you saw a change in your score after I went through and graded them again, that's what that's from. And it's set correctly now, so there's that. But question 1, grief reactions refer to which of the following? How a child reacts to a temporary or permanent disruption in a routine, a separation, or the change in the relationship, and that reaction is often outside of their control is the correct answer. People either chose that or how a student reacts, just how a student reacts to death. The first chapter, chapter 33, referred mainly to how a child reacted to death in general, but if you went to page, or not chapter 33, chapter 34, and then if you went to chapter 35, which I am going to, it has that definition of grief on page 671, where it talks about just the losses that are inherently associated with childhood, and how situational losses don't necessarily lead to a complicated grief reaction. Things like divorce, deployment, illness, they can be those types of situational losses that could likely result in a grief response because there's such a major change or disruption to your routine. So the correct answer was that A selection. Question 2, the experience of having a loved one die is called bereavement, and that is on in chapter 34, where we are talking about, I think it's on this first page here. Nope, it's on page 651. Bereavement is the experience of having a loved one die, whereas grief is that individual's reaction to the bereavement process. And then you also have the terms mourning, and that's the outward expression of the grief. So just being able to differentiate those terms is important. And so that brings us to question 3, where I asked you to differentiate the terms. So mourning is that outward expression of the grief, and mourning is reflecting societal, spiritual, and cultural traditions. And so how you mourn, how you express your grief is highly dependent on, your culture, your spiritual and the spiritual traditions in the society that you're in. So, there's a very big difference between how Native Americans view and show the outward expression of grief when someone dies versus how, a Southern Baptist would do so. Question 4. The majority of children first experience intense grief following the death of a pet. And that's on page 651. Says it word for word, first sentence of the second full paragraph on that page. If you think about it, sadly, animals don't live as long as humans. And so a pet can be a huge part of a family, and it is likely to die before, maybe grandparents or parents will. And so that's an intense grief. That's a change in that procedure and that routine that the child has. And then it's, the permanent loss of something that is important to them. Question 5, name and differentiate the 2 types of distress. And this is on page 652. First full paragraph. The 2 types of distress are separation distress and traumatic distress. And I was wanting you to differentiate how that separation distress is being preoccupied with the death and missing that person, longing to be with the person, and feeling that sense of loneliness after the person dies. Whereas traumatic distress indicates, you have disbelief about the death. You isolate yourself from others. Your emotional stability is off. You're not able to maintain that. And then you have super painful emotions that can indicate themselves in anger and then hyperarousal and vigilance. And so that's the difference between kind of that separation distress that is more normal versus that traumatic distress that leads you down into that complicated grief area. Question 6. A good assessment of grief should include a broad-based behavioral screener, interviews with the child and caregiver, measures of perception, such as the extended grief inventory, observations, or all of the above. And the correct answer was all of the above. You'd probably start with direct interviews, or you may start with a screener. But a good assessment before a diagnosis, things like that, and also a good assessment in order to gain information, in order to kind of drive your treatment plan, you would need information from all of those sources, or at least more than one. A good assessment is always multifaceted, looking at multiple sources, multiple settings, and over time. For anything, not just for grief, but any assessment that you're doing, you want to look at you want to use multiple methods. So that's why we're using observations, rating scales, self-reports, interviews with others. So multiple methods, multiple settings, multiple raters, and over time. Question 7. Complicated grief can last less than a year. And as far as the DSM criteria, that is not true. Complicated grief lasts at least a year. And otherwise, it's just kind of considered within that normal realm of grief. Question 8, losses that can lead to complicated grief reactions include. The answer is all of the above, and it's on that first page of chapter 35, where it talks about how some of those situational losses can result in a traumatic grief, a complicated grief reaction. However, death is still, the one that is most commonly associated with that complicated grief reaction. And finally, question 9, helping a child identify support systems is one way to treat complicated grief. That's true. That's in that treating complicated grief section. So it's bolstering coping strategies and identifying support systems on page 675. You can also conduct an inventory on how the child is feeling and decide on the type and level of intervention. Those are things that you can do in order to help a child that is dealing with that complicated grief reaction. As far as the rest of the, the chapters that we didn't have quizzes over, be familiar with them. I mean, obviously this is an open book assessment because it's online and I can't stop you from using your book. But, flip through. If you haven't read all the chapters, at least look at the headings, things like that, to know where you might want to go look, because this assessment is timed and you're not going to have time to just go through and find the answer to every question if you don't know where to look. So at least at the very minimum, be cognizant of what the chapters cover and where things might be within the book. So for example, you need to know that, health crises and economic crises are things that we're talking about and what they're in there. So if I'm asking you about a tornado, you're not going to go to chapter 22 on war and terrorism to start looking. You're going to start in chapter 30 on the natural disasters. So, just be smart about your studying. And I do recommend studying for your online test, just because there's a lot of information to cover, a lot of chapters that are being covered, and you at least want to know where to look. So those are my tips. Like I said, it'll be posted tomorrow. I really recommend at least looking at those essay questions. It'll probably be late tomorrow, so look at those essay questions on Saturday and start formulating, what you might answer them, because um, honestly, my expectations are higher now. You've seen a test before. I was not thrilled with the midterm grades overall, especially since I gave you the majority of the questions and answers beforehand. So, take the time and care about your studies and care about this topic, because it may be an elective class for you, but it is something that those of you who are going into a school as administration or teachers, or into the mental health career as counselors, things like that, it is something that is going to be vitally important to you, and it's something that you don't get in any other course except for this one. And none of your other training will address what to do in a crisis situation. So, thank you for participating in the class, and I hope that you learned something from this.